So next up, we have Camden Martin with the Franco-American Parish Schools and the roles in maintaining the French language.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd just like to take this time to both thank Patrick Lacroix and Daniel Moreau for having invited me to give my speech here today. I am greatly honored at this privilege, as well as very thankful to all those who were involved in making this a reality. It's very exciting to me. I have to say, going into this, I did all this research in French, so sometimes I might say certain words, and so you'll have to help out with the English correspondences. But I'm very excited to share this with you. So to give you a little bit of background information about myself, I grew up in Lewiston, Auburn, Franco-American. I would say Franco-American on paper in the sense that growing up in my household, French was neither spoken. I was born to a converted Protestant family and didn't really do many Franco-American traditions. Didn't grow up with torsière, didn't grow up with many things. And I knew that my grandparents spoke French, and I knew that I was of French descent, but that was about it. And you know, when we're all going through that time period when we're teenagers trying to figure out who we are and where we come from, I really turned to my French ancestry to better understand who I was. I thought it was critical to learn French in order to do so. And then that kind of sent me on a trajectory to go live in France for 2 years. And then that from there sent me to live in Canada for 2.5 years. And it sends me here today talking with you. And I've been very, very thankful for everything that's come out of that has been fruit. And so one thing that was really interesting, all the time I always grew up, you know, like going to Lewiston, they don't talk good French, their French is broken, or these kinds of things like that. And I think even when I was younger, I had a little bit of disdain, and so I was happier that I lived in France or I lived in Quebec. And I never had the appreciation from where I came from until I started really looking into the history of Franco-Americans at Lewiston and the greater New England area. And so what I'm going to talk to you today, as Daniel had mentioned, is parish parochial school systems and how they maintain French. And it all really started with this book here, which is called La Vengeance de Renaud, which I have never read actually. I just have this book, but I think about that just now. I never sat down, I've never read this before. But anyway, I'm sure it's a good book. So La Vengeance de Renaud is Renaud's Vengeance. It was printed in France, in Tours. And this was given to me by my brother who lives in Fort Kent. He hands it to me, and I open the book. Oh, Bonjour de Renaud. He gives it to me because he knows I like French. You know, I don't really think anything of it. I do know it's a story that takes place in the Middle Ages. You know, Renaud was a knight or something like that. But when I open the book, if you can go to the next slide, I see this right here, which reads L'École Saint-Pierre, prix de calcul de lecture française grammaire accordé à Mademoiselle Muriel Marquois, which stands for like prize in calculations, French and English reading, attributed to Mademoiselle Muriel Marquois. Mademoiselle Muriel Marquois was my grandmother, and she became a Martin, but this was, first of all, I was very happy to have like a physical, tangible thing that related to my grandmother, because she had passed away. And I just remember being flabbergasted having read this all in French, and if you can see, it says in Lewiston, Maine, 12th of June, 1941. And so that just really like set all kinds of questions in my head. What were Franco-Americans learning in these schools? Like, obviously, they were able to master French because those of you who have studied French, this is all written in le passé simple. So it's very, you know, like complicated stuff. It's not just oui, bonjour, you know, it's like some serious stuff here. So I was just like, wow, I always knew my grandmother spoke French, and she grew up at, you know, attended parochial school, but I didn't really think much of it. And so that really sent me on this kind of rabbit hole where I find myself today of trying to understand what did Franco-Americans, what were they exposed to in parochial school systems. If you want to hit to the next one. So a little about focus. So here we have it. I'm just going to read out to you. It says École la Paroisse Saint-Pierre Saint Paul Lewiston, Maine. This is dated 1912. This is a postcard I have. This is actually really great. I was realizing when Timothy was talking, you guys did your research in like the chronology of talking, because I don't have to explain French Canadian immigration anymore. So thank you, Timothy. So as French Canadians are coming to Lewiston Auburn in the 1870s, really establishing themselves, we obviously the needs of maintaining what's known as la survivance is a very predominant priority. And within the survivance is the question of Catholic faith and traditions, and of course the French language. And so very early on in Lewiston, we see you know, clergy members and private citizens getting together to instruct Franco-American children. And it really isn't until the 1880s. I'm just pointing to it. I'll let you know.
I'm getting ready.
Exactly. That we see schools that are being built for the purpose of teaching Franco-American students. And so this was known as Le Collège. Now, there was other schools a little bit before. You had the orphanage Notre-Dame de Lourdes, which was the first bilingual education given in Maine in the 1870s for French and English. It was run by Les Sœurs Grises, or the Grey Nuns of Quebec. Not really a school order, more of like dealing with hospitalier, things, hospital stuff. And so they made a call to their clergy, and which was the St. Peter and St. Paul's parish in Lewiston, which is the first mother parish of Lewiston. And they have les Dames de Sion, the ladies of Zion, who come to Lewiston. They were from France to teach students. There was some like bickering between, because the sisters coming from France had a way they wanted to teach French, and then those coming from French guys. So there was a little bit of some conflict, if you will, a little bit. That ended, only lasted a couple of years. We've seen the Dominican bloc, there was a school, and there was also a school in Little Canada, the Petite École du Petit Canada. But this was the first real establishment that was a school. So this only lasted from the 1880s into the early 1900s, and it was run by the Marist order, which was an order that was coming directly from France, and then via Quebec came through to New England. And this was actually their first school that they opened in the United States, in the province of the United States. So eventually this school became St. Peter and St. Paul's School. And as the Franco-American community is growing in Lewiston, we see a lot of satellite parishes that are establishing. And this, of course, is not just happening in Lewiston, this is happening in all of the major Franco-American centers across New England. So wherever it be Fall River, Woonsocket, Manchester, places like Leominster and Southbridge, even smaller places, all these very similar system. And right at the beginning, all of these national parishes, French Canadian national parishes, established bilingual schooling. The idea was you need to maintain the old, but also have to make sure that students are learning English and they're learning the culture of their adopted country. And most of the time, Franco-American students, this was the first time that they were learning English was in the parochial school system, as early as the 1870s, but all the way into the 1950s. That was a lot of times the first exposure that Franco-American students had to English. What else did I want to say? Yeah, there we go. We can continue with the next one. So something that fundamentally was always very curious to me is what exactly were they learning? So I know you kind of have to squint here to look at this. So this is the nature of classes that were given. This is an example from St. Matthew's School in Central Falls. It was published in 1917. And if anyone does any French Canadian research, you know that they were very thorough in what they have. I mean, even in this book, they have how much they were paying for coal for the church and everything. But anyways, so they break it down by what classes are being taught in which language. And so most of the, so here we have catechism, holy history, French language, writing, mostly things that dealt with the church. History of Canada were taught in French. And then, of course, everything that was science, math, civics, geography were generally taught in English. And this was all across New England. Let's say I want to switch to that. Now, what's interesting is around this time period, a little bit later than the 1920s and 30s, there's something upwards of over 200 Franco-American parochial schools all across New England, where the teaching staff was more than 3,000. Mostly, of course, done by religious orders. And so it was quite its own little infrastructure of Franco-American communities, if you will. If you want to go to the next slide. So these original schools were only really meant to go up to 6th grade, eventually 8th grade, and then most of the Franco-Americans who had the luxury, as Timothy put out, to go into school would go to public school, because there was most of the times there wasn't a secondary school that Franco-American students could go to. So right here on the right-hand side, it says École Supérieure Saint-Dominique, Lewiston, Maine, and it's bulletin trimestriel. It's for Monsieur Dubois, 1945. As you can see, all of the paper trail is all in French. It's saying what classes he had. He did very well, all A's, holy. And he's doing really, really well here. I just thought it was amazing to me that up into the 40s, still the administration was done in French. Obviously, classes that were English were done completely in English. But the idea was a student coming out of l'École Saint-Dominique in Lewiston, or was it l'École Prévost in Fall River, they were like completely bilingual, just as able to talk about Shakespeare as they were able to talk about Molière. To me, that was very fundamental, very interesting to me. And on the left here, we have a little bit of what I call Franco-American propaganda here on the left. For those of you who are familiar with catechism, it's this idea, you have it's question responses. It's this idea, who created the world, God, right? It was, for children to learn very quickly and memorize these nuggets of information. So in 1938, and this was published in 1939, Joseph Benoit, who became later on the mayor of Manchester for 9 mandates in a row, the longest lasting Manchester mayor of New Hampshire in recorded history, wrote this book because he took it upon himself to kind of, I would say, kind of indoctrinate amongst Franco-American youth this idea that you come from a big people, you come from French explorers who went down all the way to the Mississippi, and he really wanted to bring that upon Franco-Americans. In a way, he explained, around this time period, the 1930s, we all knew about Lewis and Clark and all these people who were idolized and were made heroes. He wanted the equivalent for Franco-American students. So I thought that was very interesting. And so when you read it, it goes through 3 parts. The first part is you learn about French exploration in North America, colonization, immigration from Quebec to other places in North America. And then in the last part, you actually learn about Franco-American history, like proper Franco-American history. Like one question is, what are the Franco-American newspapers that are more than 50 years of existence, and like lists them all out, and it makes sure that Franco-American students, they know this, which I find is very interesting, because nowadays most people really don't know these kinds of questions, even though who attended parochial school in the 50s and 60s really don't know these questions or answers. And if you see on the bottom, it says publié sous les auspices de la Société historique franco-américaine, so under the auspices of the Franco-American Historical Society, which was a very large intellectual organization that existed in New England out of Boston. And when this book came out, it was immediately a great success. And if you look back in the back, it's like, for all Franco-Americans to have it on their chevet, how do you say it? Bedside table, yeah, exactly. And it's safe to assume that this would have been used also in Lucien Armand all across Franco-American parochial schools in New England, and it was greatly acclaimed. If you want to hit the next one. So another thing that I find really interesting to me is we're talking about that structure of Franco-American parochial schools that exist in New England, and I thought to me, what was this environment look like? How did the Franco-American elite, whether it be clergymen or doctors and lawyers, that made it up to that social rank, how did they stimulate the desire to maintain what was la survivance, if you will? So one thing that they did was they Prix d'Excellence at the end of the year, which was this example of that book. So this is actually a tradition I found out was in this publishing company, Maison Alfred Mamé et Fils, was often, even in small rural Quebec towns, they would give these out to students at the end of the year, if they did really well in a certain subject. And that tradition maintained itself all the way into New England. And particularly this edition, I found it in Adolphe Robert, who's from Manchester, wrote about when he was growing up in this little town that they used to give these out at the end of the year, very red covers and all that. So I found that really fascinating. And then you also have these organizations. For example, you had a society in Fall River, which was called the Concours de Français de Fall River, where they would come up with different contests to stimulate students and Franco-Americans, attributing importance to the French language, and they'd give out prizes just in Fall River proper. Now, on top of that, you would also have important scholarships that were given by mutual fraternal societies that existed in New England, such as L'Union Saint-Jean-Baptiste d'Amérique or l'Association Canado-Américaine, Union being from Woonsocket and the ACA being from Manchester, also would give out scholarships to students who did well in their French programs and attended parochial school systems, so that they could continue that trajectory of staying within the Franco-American realm. A lot of times they would give out scholarships to students to go to Assumption College in Worcester, to go to seminaries in Quebec, or what was known as the Collège Classique. And on top of that, they would give out these little medals here. So I have that one there. I am a notorious eBay buyer. Spent all of my money basically on these things. I have enough to eat. Ramen noodles are good. No, I'm just kidding. It's right here. So I just found this really fascinating. So this was produced by L'Union Saint-Jean-Baptiste d'Amérique, and they would have them minted and given out to all the students each year. It started in 1941. I think this series here, and then maybe in early 1950s. And they would give this out to somewhere up to like over 200 students annually. They would be giving this based on how well they did in French. And I just found that very interesting that they took the time to have these, made. to go to schools. They had that connection. And in the how do you say that there? The monthly periodical that was published by L'Union Saint-Jean-Baptiste in the month of June, they would actually list out every single student that received this award. And so on the back, it says École Saint-Jean-Baptiste, Marcel Dumoulin. I found out who this was. He attended Rumford Parochial School, St. John the Baptist School, and he ended up becoming a priest and served in Lewis and Auburn. I met some people that knew. Actually, my father remembers him. And got in 1950. The first year they gave this out, it was actually the ambassador of France who went to each of the parochial schools of New England and attributed these to each of the students, which I find very fascinating. And then the last little piece here is the Bourse Nagier, or the Nagier scholarships. It was a scholarship program that existed to provide funding to Franco-Americans and those who excelled in French to be able to do like master's and doctoral research in France. And I had mentioned earlier Joseph Benoit. He actually was a recipient of the Bourse Nagier and did his doctoral research in the University of Sorbonne in Paris, where he wrote his thesis called L'âme franco-américaine, or the Franco-American soul. And it's actually in that book where he talks about the need to have something similar to the catechism. And I just find that very interesting that there existed this kind of environment where, there was people going back and forth, and once again stimulating that idea of maintaining French. Why don't you go to the next one? So it's without contestation. It's without a doubt that the Franco-American parochial school system played an important role in maintaining French language. But I was also curious, where did it perhaps fall short? And so the system I just described to you did pretty well from maybe the 1880s till 1930s. After World War II, everything begins to change. It's the first time a lot of people. There's a lot of factors playing: radio, television. Those who went to war came back, so something else. There's all kinds of things. But Raymond Lepage gives this really interesting reflection on bilingualism in parochial schools from the point of view of the student. It was published from Assumption College back in 1990. And he attended school in both St. Mary and St. Peter and St. Paul's parish. And he talks about what he received as an education. And it's interesting because he says at that time, as you can read, French was exclusively on the program as an ethnic language, an erroneous method which made the language a means of expression associated with ancestral values in the good old days. That is to say, an atrophied and anemic language far removed from the reality of the country. Now, I was really interested by that and what he meant, and what I've come to kind of to a conclusion is, like I said earlier, all the scientific and math courses were always taught in English, and it was a way to create a bridge so that students coming out of school could obtain those kinds of jobs. And so French was really perceived by students in parochial school systems as this, like grandparent language. It's not something that's going to help us immediately in our daily life, which was different 10, 20 years prior. My father attending Holy Family Church and parochial school system growing up. I was talking about this, what I was going to say this week, and he said it's the first time I really thought about this, but he said in the 8 years I attended Holy Family Parochial School, not once did anyone ever put the connection between learning French and our Franco-American identity. They never put two and two together. It was just like something you did, but they didn't like have a communication about it. St. Peter's School was a little bit different. They did talk a little bit more about it, and it definitely retained that Franco-American identity piece, if you will. So now in my research, what I'm trying to find a little bit more about is the psychological effects of a minority group trying to retain its identity all within a majority Anglophone sea, if you will, and what did that have for an impact? And in doing this research, I interviewed a couple of different individuals who had attended parochial school systems. I asked them a series of questions like, did you feel prepared for the reality in which you lived after you came out of school? How much reading did you do in French? I asked them a lot of specific questions to see what their relationship was with French. And a lot of it was, we didn't do a lot of reading. Most of it was done in English, even though there was an expansive amount of books in French. And so I'm really curious as why was that? So I really find myself kind of digging deeper in that rabbit hole. Hopefully I'll see the light one day at the end. But I just thought it would be interesting to kind of share with you what I found, and be happy to answer any questions that you have. I do have to mention, I do work now at St. Dominic Academy, which is the former parochial school, which used to be bilingual. So, all as a way of reconnecting, if you will, which is pretty interesting. But merci beaucoup. Thank you.
questions?
Wait.
Hi. So, I guess, so I recently interviewed someone about her experience in parochial school as well, and what she said was that it seemed to her like they got a great education in religion, French language, history,
Right.
but not really in math and science. And like when she ended up later going to college, she was like, oh. And is that something that you
Oh, that's a very recurring theme. It's like standard there for you, for sure. Like one thing that the former parochial school students pat themselves on the back is exactly what you mentioned, but also how to well behave, how to memorize, things like that. But Raymond Lepage, he talks about when he's getting at, like when he went to university, he's like, I had no idea what these words were in French for science and things like that. And so it really created this gap in terms of intellectual capability. I often say, someone from those, like my father, for example, he grew up speaking French. He went to school up to a certain point, but he's lacking the vocabulary to be able to talk about like metaphysical things, or like he can talk religious things, he can talk certain, but he wasn't able to talk about science or math. And so everything that is relevant to that world is in English, and that was also a very assimilating factor as well. So that it's a very common theme, and not just in Lewiston, but across New England. Thank you for that question. It's a good question. Go ahead. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Wonderful presentation. I was noticing as you were talking that you were making reference more often than not to a transatlantic connection to France. Looking at sort of the tradition of the Catholics who are coming over to the New World, both in Quebec and in New England. I'm wondering if you've delved into any of the research, or maybe this could spark some more conversations of how education was secularizing in France at the time, and many of the people who were coming over actually they had a protectionist idea of what that education should look like, and then transplanting that to the New World, in their the New World of New France, and reinvigorating those ideas. I don't know, have you come across anything
well, it's
like
funny
that?
that you mentioned, so that you're talking about a period that was the initial period, and then it was even reinforced back in the 1870s and 80s, because one of us remember in the 1870s and 80s, France was very anti-clerical. I think it was just after Napoleon III. And so a lot of these orders are coming to Canada, and like the Dominican order, the Marist order, many different kinds. And so they have that mentality, like, we're being persecuted, we're gonna like attend to the good flock here, and we're gonna really shape their minds so that they remain good Catholics and French people of the old regime, like the old France. That's what they would refer to themselves, like, nous sommes la vieille France ici, we're the old France here. And I think that was even transmitted into Franco-American mentality into the 20s and 30s for sure. Really begins to change in 40s, 50s, and then ultimate end like early 60s. But that's very common, very common thing that I would see in my research here, which I wasn't able to bring out in a lot of like 15 minutes, but that's a really good question. Just a minute.
Yeah. So I have kind of a big question.
Ooh, I like
and
big
I would love to honestly hear from everybody. So if anybody else has any comments, but so I had an interview this week with Noah Willett, the consulate in Boston. He was talking about how he's going up to Caribou Presqu'île and Madawaska to talk about immersion programs in schools, which I was so excited to hear. But of course, my research is very much centered in Lewiston. I've interviewed you, hung out a lot with Anna this summer, and he added, so that happened. And then later yesterday, I had an interview with Radio Canada, and somebody asked me a question: what do you see as the future of French in Maine? And from my perspective as a French professor, I think we do need to start in the schools, but I would love to hear what you think, being from Lewiston, being Franco-American, and also a French teacher now. And especially, exactly, right? Especially given like the very unique linguistic coincidence we have in Lewiston right now with the Franco-Africans and Franco-Americans. How could you see? It's a big question, I know, but how do you maybe see that element? Like, what is the role of the community members in the future of French in Lewiston?
That's a really good question. I think about this constantly. It's something that probably keeps me up at night. But I think that's probably why it's so fundamental to me that I did this research about what existed prior, so that we can learn from that to apply it to today. Because that's my hope and dream, that we have more immersion programs in bilingual schools. And I think it's a beautiful thing when, whatever ethnic group comes into a different area and they're able to establish schools. That's like it's like a big kudos to them, that they're able to establish that and have the desire to maintain identity, whoever the ethnic group. And so I think exactly right. It's through the schooling system, because the more and more I teach, the more and more I in the school system, again, I realize how fundamental it is to someone's upbringing and how they can perceive life. Like statistics. I mean, I'm with my students probably with my students than they were with their own parents. They go to school more often, so we have a really important role to play in forming their minds. And if we're able to bring French on top of that, I think that would have major it would be very beneficial in that regard, because that's how in French we say that l'école paroissiale was a pierre angulaire, the cornerstone of la survivance, and greatly in part because provided Catholic and French education. So granted, our values are not necessarily the same, but we're able to provide something similar in the sense of bilingualism and learn from our mistakes and do both. All in French and all in English, in the sense that get exposed to English science notions, get exposed to French notions. I think that would be very, very beneficial, and it would make us more competent in both worlds and be able to, have even stronger, links to both Quebec, New Brunswick, France, and of course the new Francophone speakers are coming into Lucerne, Auburn, and the greater Maine area. But it's something I think about often, actually. How can we better introduce the French language immersion programs? And I was working with Noah a little bit on that too. There's a lot of potential, and I think if properly managed, and because definitely the desire is there, maybe just need some fine tuning about which doors we're knocking on and how we make that possible. But I think it's a very possible likelihood. If not properly capitalized on, would be very unfortunate, but I think it's possible. Thank you. Oui, monsieur.
So because you're a French teacher in a parochial school, have you found that your research kind of mingled with your professional life?
It very does. I spent a lot of time in their archive room at school. So one thing I like to do with my students is I show them a yearbook from like the 1940s and 50s, and I say, hey, look, everything is half written in French, half written in English. You are living in a system that was founded like this. I mean, you are the legacy of what has been established before. St. Dom's established in 1941, just celebrated its 80th anniversary. So I try to bring that to kind of provide some context to what potential exists today and what has existed in the past. One of the first things I do when I have a class is I ask everyone, raise your hand if you have a meme and to this day, like 3/4 of the class will raise their hand. So I say, well, that means you're a French descent, and there's a good chance that it would be an excellent French resource, when you have questions on homework. And but they really have, today's generation has really no idea what it's occurred. Like they had no idea that St. Dom's was French speaking before. Like I'm the first one to have explained that to them. And I think that has a profound impact on how they create a relationship with the language and bring importance to it. If that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Anything else? Well, thank you guys very much for your time. I appreciate it immensely.
Thank you, Camden. So right now we have time for a 15-minute break, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes.
Great.